Hello, sewing friends. Thanks for visiting the TurboPurr channel, where we love the sounds of happy cats and smooth running sewing machines. My name is Ramona. Today, I'm showing my version of the Cat's Meow quilt pattern by Box Quilts. I purchased this pattern from a quilt shop several years ago and finally got around to making it. I decided to use what I call realistic colors for the cats, and I also used my serger to do some of the quilt piecing. This video is for entertainment purposes only, and I hope you enjoy it. These are the supplies that I used. I like to use a serger sometimes for quilt piecing where it is just to make things go a little bit faster and easier sometimes. And it really just kind of depends on the quilt and how straight the pieces are. These are the pieces that all the parts of the quilt front that I cut out, and I labeled the pieces according to the quilt pattern for the connecting strips that are not embroidered. Um, I actually used leftover fabric from the superhero quilt, which is shown in another video. The red and white Swiss dotted fabrics are leftovers from that quilt. And I had quite a bit of applique fabric for the various appliques that were done. The quilt pattern included a USB stick with all of the applique embroidery designs on it, so I followed the instructions and stitched out all of those embroidered and applique pieces. One difference that I did is I used my Floriani software before embroidering some of the blue pieces that you see that are embroidered. I went into Floriani software to digitize the seam lines and the 1/4 inch seam allowances on those embroidered blocks. I sometimes really struggle with getting my embroideries centered when I'm cutting them out. So that's why I use the Floriani software. So I digitized the seam line and then the cutting line on those blocks, and then use the file and merge option in the Floriani software to add the embroideries in, and then use the software to center the embroidery within the seam lines. And so I just wanted to mention that variation that I did. I also used Floriani Heat and Gone topper on some of the blocks. I like to use a topper on embroideries when they are fairly dense. It's to me, it's a little bit tedious sometimes getting it all removed. uh, the iron removes most of it, but sometimes I do have to go back and take some tweezers to get the rest of it out. Certainly with wash away toppers, if you're using those, then you need to wash it out later. So I usually end up using the Heat and Gone as a topper. I fused lightweight fusible interfacing to the back of each of the embroidered applique quilt blocks before I hooped them. I wanted to use that to avoid having additional pull on the fabric. Sometimes that really helps with keeping the fabric flat during embroidery. And of course, I also used a stabilizer in addition to using the fusible interfacing. So I had a layer of fusible tearaway stabilizer, then a layer of lightweight fusible interfacing on the back of these applique embroidered blocks. In this photo, not all of the stabilizers have been removed. Some of them have, but this is a picture of the work in progress on the back of the quilt top. You can see that um, some of the piecing was done with the serger. I tried to cut very carefully around the quilt blocks and the appliques just to make sure everything was there. I left larger than 1/4 inch seam allowances on some of the blocks, and I had all the seam lines marked with a heat away pin on the back of the block so that I could piece everything accurately. And this is a detail showing some of the serged seams. I used a 3-thread overlock seam for some of the piecing, and with doing this, in general, the seams are pressed towards the darker fabric. This helps to eliminate any show through on the front of the fabric of the seams. And this is uh, a detail showing free motion quilting. I free motion quilted with a stitch regulator over the entire quilt sandwich, with the exception of the red Swiss dot frames around the cats. I left those unquilted. I just stitched in the ditch in the seams around the red pieces. The rest of the quilt is free motion quilted with a stitch regulator, and I used a denser pattern of free motion quilting around the cats to kind of help the cats pop out. So I didn't free motion quilt on the appliques themselves. I free motion quilted around the appliques. Incidentally, there's different brands of machines now that have the built-in stitch regulators, and you can do this the same without a stitch regulator on any machine. You can do free motion quilting. You just need to check your machine manual's instructions about how to do that. And this is an illustration of the quilt sandwich. So we have the quilt top, the batting, and the backing, and the binding. The pattern for this called for a 2.5-inch wide binding strip, and that is folded in half and pressed with the wrong sides together. So the pretty side is on the outside with the binding folded in half. I stitched the raw edges of the binding to the back side of the quilt sandwich and then pressed it and folded around to the front. It's your option. There's many different ways of applying quilt bindings around. Some people like to stitch the binding to the front of the quilt and wrap it around. To me, it's just kind of a personal preference, and it somewhat depends on the quilt, how you want to approach that. So this is a detail showing the serger seam where I sewed the folded You can tell this is folded in half. The 2.5-inch strip has been folded in half and pressed, and with a 3-thread overlock stitch on the serger, I serged this quilt border all the way around, mitering the corners, and then connecting the loose end together at the end. The wrapped folded border is going around the edge on this, and this is the front of the quilt. I had I thought it would be nice to add a little embellishment of rickrack to the binding. So I had a very narrow rickrack. It's called baby rickrack. And so I tucked that into the edge of the quilt binding as I was sewing around the quilt binding and mitering the edges so that I would catch it within the stitching here. So that is the front corner. I have a separate video talking about how to create quilt labels, and so I'll put a link in the description box to that. This is basically a summary of how to do that as shown in that other video. I also included the baby rickrack into the quilt label that I did for this quilt. And the way that I did that is I digitized this quilt label in my Sewnet software, and before stitching down the decorative satin stitch, I stitched the baby rickrack all around the circle of that. And so the way I did that is I used the foot control on the embroidery machine and went basically stitch by stitch to catch the baby rickrack into the circle. And then after that, the green satin stitch was stitched over the outside, one of the outside edges of the rickrack, and covered up the straight stitching. So just to mention that, it can be tedious to do things like that, but it really adds a nice detail sometimes. And these are my sewing companions, Miss Boo and Mr. Robin. I hope that you have enjoyed this video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe. I'd love to hear about what quilts you are working on in the comments, and thank you very much for watching. Happy stitching and have a fabulous, wonderful day. Thank you.